Welcome back. So in this video we're going to move into protected investing, and what I'm going to show you here is a simple way of removing a lot of work from investing and ensure that you consistently do better than your fund manager. Let's just talk about standard investing in the stock market. Now, investors in general terms spend a huge amount of time and worry researching the markets, and they look at screen after screen, they read website after website, they will go all over the internet just trawling for data, hoping to find some nugget of research that will help them invest in the right company and do something that's profitable and safe. Now, that's a lot of work and a lot of hours people spend, and what you've got to ask yourself is, why do they do that? Why do investors and traders feel they have to spend all that time? And you've probably heard me talk about this before, and the reason is they have something that I call the investor's number one fear. And this is how the investor's number one fear goes. They sort of say, the company I'm invested in could lose value, and this means my shares will lose value, and they could keep losing value, and I'll lose everything. And this is why people panic and panic sell in the stock market. It's all driven by this fear, and ultimately they're trying to stop themselves ending up like this, screaming at their computer and realizing they've made a terrible mistake in the markets, and they're just watching their share price plummet, and they've got nothing to do but sell and protect themselves because they've got this fear of their share price going to absolute zero. Now, why do investors feel like this? Why do they feel they have to do all that research, and why do they have that fear of ending up like that? And it's because when you're investing in an individual company, that fear is very real and it's absolutely true. So investing in an individual company does mean that the company you're invested in could lose value. It does mean, in that case, your shares would lose value, and they could keep losing value, couldn't they? And you could lose everything. Now, obviously, that's not going to happen every single time you invest, but nevertheless, the fear is there, it's real, and that's why people react the way that they do. And just to underline those dangers in investing in individual companies, I just want to talk a bit about Kodak, and this is just one example. I could have picked many more, but for most people who certainly are my age, this is an example of a company that were absolutely massive by the standards of their day. They were the equivalent of Google or Microsoft today. They were absolute giants in their own technological area. They're absolute giants in the area where they ruled the world, which of course was photography. So in 1975, not a lot of people know this, but Kodak were the first company to build a working digital camera. Now, Kodak actually made all their money in an entirely different area. Obviously, they made their money in photography, but the money they made, they had a 90% market share for photographic film, traditional cameras, and an 85% share of traditional camera sales in the US. That was where they were. Now, I don't know how many of you can remember digital cameras when they first came out, before they were on smartphones and things, but digital cameras used to be awful quality. They were nowhere near the quality of the physical film of its day. And so therefore, when Kodak invented this technology, two things entered their mind, and the two things were, this digital technology, although it seems quite clever, it doesn't actually look very good. And the other thing is, given that it doesn't look very good, do we actually want to put it up against something that's a lot better and that we actually make a huge amount of money out of, which is traditional photographic film and cameras? So they decided that they weren't going to invest heavily in this new technology. Now, things moved on over the years, and they did eventually get doing some things in the digital technology era. And Apple saw what was happening, and as Apple are good at doing, and Steve Jobs was good at doing, they actually took a technology that somebody else created and they turned it into something better and looked at it with a view to putting it into the mass market. So Apple started being the banner carrier for digital cameras, but no, they didn't do that till nearly 20 years later. So had Kodak actually developed the technology fully themselves and done the same as Apple eventually did with the technology, and had done it 20 years earlier, they would have been at the forefront of the technology, but that didn't happen. Now, in 2004, Kodak actually stopped selling film cameras because the digitals obviously got better and better, but it wasn't them who made the digitals better and better, it was other people, and they were tailing along behind them even though they invented the technology. And in 2005, Kodak, because they were just a big name, still had a large capability in selling digital cameras, and they had a lot of revenue in it. But by 2007 they'd fallen to 4th place, and by 2010 to 7th place, and that was because other people were developing that technology quicker and better than they were, because the other people had been looking at the mass market longer, because Kodak stepped into it late. And obviously in 2007, the thing that we all know that happened with digital photography took a completely different turn, and that's when Apple released the first iPhone. And for the younger viewers who are now watching this, you probably just come to something that actually makes some sort of sense, which is, oh yeah, cameras on phones, right? Yep, I know about those. And this was the real revolution, wasn't it? A digital camera in everyone's pocket that was thin and wasn't a cumbersome camera anymore. And in 2009, Kodak finally realizes that digital photography has replaced film and stops actually selling 35mm colour film after 74 years of production. Now, don't forget that 74 years of production was in colour film. Before that, Kodak used to do black and white film when colour film wasn't about. So Kodak had dominated this industry for nearly a century, the photography industry, and they got completely decimated by not realizing what was going on in the market. And in 2011, that was when they actually crumbled big time. The share price fell over 80% as it struggled to maintain market share, and they were hit with huge pension cost workers. So imagine they'd been this absolutely massive company, equivalent of Google or Microsoft today, big, loads of staff everywhere all over the world. All those people had got, really expensive pensions provided by the company because the company was always doing so. It was always looking after its workers. And when their income dropped, but they still had all these obligations, it meant just one thing. It meant that the company was going to die and it just couldn't sustain itself. So in 2012, Kodak filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Now, Chapter 11 is, for those of you who don't live in the States, is a stage that's sort of pre-bankruptcy in the States, where a company gets a certain amount of time to try and save itself and keep in production. So instead of being made bankrupt immediately, there's a grace period that they get to try and sort themselves out. Now, Kodak does actually still exist today, but their shares are a fraction of what they used to be. They're around the $2.50 mark at the time of recording this. Now, the reason I'm giving you this example and talk through this, it doesn't really matter whether you believe what I'm saying are the reasons for the failure are right or wrong. The fact is that they dominated an industry and they ended up not dominating it, and they absolutely killed their share price. But if you'd gone up to anybody in 1975 and said, were Kodak a good company to invest in the stock market, everybody would have given you an emphatic yes, in the same way that they give you an emphatic yes when you're talking about Microsoft, Google or Apple today. And therein lies the lesson. So we look at those companies now and we think nothing can touch them, but believe me, things do change and these companies can be touched, and people do introduce disruptive technology that totally changes what companies do. So it's important to realize that this can happen. So when an investor buys shares in an individual company, they are always at risk of what I call a Kodak moment. They are at risk of that company failing and going to zero and losing 70, 80, 90% of their investment. And that's why people panic in the stock market, okay? Because even though they go on about how safe these companies are, they know in reality that if they started dropping seriously in the price, they would panic sell and they would lose an awful amount of what they'd invested. So if that's how people panic and that's the problem with individual companies, what's my solution to that?